On this day in 1945, and 3 days after a nuclear attack on Hiroshima, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on Nagasaki, killing over 70,000 people. Nagasaki holding commemorations earlier this Saturday. That's one of two restored cathedral bells ringing in unison for the first time since the atomic bombing 80 years ago. About 2,600 people, including representatives from more than 90 countries, attended a memorial event. Survivors hoping their harrowing memories can help make their hometown the last place on Earth to be hit by a nuclear bomb. Here's the Prime Minister speaking earlier.
80 years later, the international community remains deeply divided over nuclear disarmament, and we face an extremely challenging security environment. However, no matter how difficult the circumstances may be, as the only nation to have suffered from the atomic bomb in war, it is our mission to uphold the three non-nuclear principles and take the lead in international efforts to achieve a world free of nuclear war and nuclear weapons. We will continue to make steady progress toward this goal, step by step.
Well, for more, we are joined on the set by France 24's own Yuka Royer, and from Utrecht, Netherlands, Susi Snyder, who is the program coordinator at the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons. But first, let's listen to a survivor of the Nagasaki attack. Here is Zichiro Mi telling us what he witnessed back when he was 10 years old.
I was familiar with the sound of the Americans' B-29 bomber, so I was playing at home, imitating that sound on my sister's organ. When I finished playing and was about to stand up, there was a flash of light. Moments later, a huge blast ripped through our house. A little while later, I asked my grandmother, who was living with us, "Grandma, what was that flash?" And she said that the sun had come falling down. We were that ignorant. A few days later, I went to check out our school with my friends. What we saw there was beyond our imagination. People covered in blood. We couldn't even tell whether they were men or women, were being brought in, pleading for water. They were saying, please kill us, because they were in so much pain.
Well, the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Hibakusha, have campaigned for decades for the abolition of nuclear weapons. Yuka, our reporter who spoke to Zichiro Mi on set, hello to you, Yuka. That's a harrowing testimony, but stories like that we didn't always hear before, did we?
No, it's not always been easy for survivors of the atomic bomb to speak out. Now, in the immediate aftermath of the Hiroshima bombing, the Japanese government actually blocked information out of the city and sort of downplayed its impact. And people in Nagasaki, Mr. Misei told me that had heard about a new type of bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima, but had no idea about the damage it had caused. And after the war ended, American occupying forces strictly censored images out of the images of the destruction out of the two cities for years, up until about 1952, and dismissing Japanese reports about radiation sickness during that time as propaganda. Now, for a long time then, what the public was allowed to see was sort of aerial photographs, a bird's-eye view of the effectiveness of those new types of bombs without actually showing the actual human casualty, human suffering that was happening on the ground. And it wasn't until 1982 that an atomic bomb survivor gave his testimony at the United Nations. Now, his name was Senji Yamaguchi, and he made his historic No More Hiroshima, No More Nagasaki speech at the UN. And as a member of Nihon Hirenkyo, that organization, of course, received the Nobel Peace Prize last year for its years of advocating for peace through testimonies like Mr. Yamaguchi's of the survivors. Now, for years after the war, those who were exposed to radiation, as you said, known as hibakusha, suffered various health problems, but also faced social stigma. Some were never able to marry or have children, and even those born after the bombing of affected parents faced discrimination. This made it even more difficult for survivors to speak out, and some of them remained silent for decades and decades and decades, and only came out with their stories in their late 70s and 80s in recent years. Now, that generation is disappearing fast. There are fewer than 100,000 survivors of the atomic bomb, and their average age has now exceeded 86. Some of them continue to tell their stories in public or to school children, like Mr. Mise does, hoping to pass on their collective memory to future generations. But in the current context, in the current geopolitical environment, there's a real sense of fear that that collective memory is at risk of fading, that people are about to forget what fallout of nuclear weapons really looks like.
Yeah, Susie, 80 years on, Japan, the only country to suffer a nuclear attack. What message, what lessons should the world have learned from these two bombings?
Well, I think the most important thing is to remember that there were some survivors. There was a life under the mushroom cloud. And there was a reality that these weapons, which are designed to indiscriminately destroy cities, still exist. And they can be stopped. Fortunately, there's a UN treaty, the prohibition of nuclear weapons, which more than half of the world's nations have signed, that's both stigmatize and prohibit everything to do with these weapons. And that's what the survivors have called for decades. They've said, never again, no more Hiroshima, no more Nagasaki. And that's the message that we have to take with us today. And we have to remember both what has happened with those individuals, the stories that they have shared, their traumatizing, heart-wrenching stories, their courage in calling for an end to these weapons, and to continue to do this to make sure that their legacy lives on and prevents another Hiroshima, prevents another Nagasaki. It's a choice that we can make and we can implement today.
Yeah, and that message from those survivors, you think no government would appreciate that as much as their own government. So, Susie, why hasn't Japan signed that UN treaty?
Unfortunately, Japan is in a pro-nuclear weapons relationship with the United States, in which they have a deterrence agreement that the United States could potentially, if they choose to, use nuclear weapons on behalf of Japan. Now, the details of that agreement are not very well known, but it's rather hypocritical for the Japanese government to expect and anticipate and potentially rely on the use of nuclear weapons when it has experienced what that use means. And there is an alternative. Most of the countries in the world, 2/3 of all countries, have no such agreement. They do not support the use of nuclear weapons. And it is terrifying that Japan has forgotten its own history, its own legacy, has ignored the demand of the hibakusha. 70% of hibakusha want Japan to sign the prohibition on nuclear weapons, the UN treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons. And Japan has just brushed it aside. So there's lovely words that are given today and given at these commemorations, but these words need to be followed up with action, because otherwise nuclear weapons will be used again, and we will see another city razed to the ground the way we saw Hiroshima and Nagasaki razed 80 years ago.
Yuka, Nagasaki praying for a nuclear-free future. The threat of nuclear warfare, though, is on the rise. Japan, at this time, actually boosting military spending, too.
That's right. Well, the message that was repeated during the ceremony today was to make Nagasaki the last place on Earth to have been ever attacked by a nuclear weapon, with Hiroshima being the world's first ever. Now, that's a genuine hope shared by many in Japan and elsewhere, and officially the Japanese government sticks to its 3 non-nuclear principles, which is not possessing, producing, or allowing the introduction of nuclear weapons on its soil. But the reality is, as we just heard from Susie, is that Japan is protected under the United States nuclear umbrella in the face of ever-aggressive North Korea and in the face of China's military buildup. So the official line is to maintain the old world order, under the NPT, as Susie mentioned, but it has not. And the Nagasaki mayor once again called on the government to go beyond that and to start participating, at least, even as observers, at talks to ban nuclear weapons, to prohibit nuclear weapons from the face of the earth. Also, though, public sentiment in Japan has been shifting somewhat. Last month saw a far-right Sanseito party make strong showing in Japan's upper house elections with their populist Japan First mantra, striking a chord with the younger generation and the working class. But behind that populist agenda, the party also openly supports the idea of Japan diverting from its long-held non-nuclear stance. One candidate who actually won a seat in Tokyo even said that nuclear armament is the most cost-effective way to protect the country. That's the party that many people voted for in this year's elections, including, and this is noteworthy, they did particularly well in Hiroshima and quite well in Nagasaki as well.
Susie, for proponents of nuclear deterrence, that's a common argument, isn't it? You've written before about how the risk is as high as it's ever been. What conflicts in the world are you looking at when you say that?
What we have seen over the last few years is we've seen an increase in the threats around nuclear weapons use. We've seen overt threats in Russia and around the Ukraine crisis and the conflict there. We've also seen an escalation of threat in Israel and by Israel about the possibility of using their nuclear weapons. And we are extremely lucky that just a few months ago, the conflict between India and Pakistan was de-escalated before it went nuclear, because these are two nuclear-armed neighbors that are constantly having strife with one another. And those different situations they make me worry quite a bit, because there are more nuclear nations than there were at the time of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and not all of these nations are led by those who are predictable, who are stable, and who can make good judgments in a time of crisis. See, these 9 nuclear-armed states, it's individuals, and it's the leadership of these 9 states that choose to use nuclear weapons or not. And they make those decisions at a moment's notice, and generally without full information, because no one has full information in these high crisis situations. And once that weapon is launched, the likelihood, through different studies, through modeling, is that it will escalate to a nuclear war. So even an accident or a misunderstanding could spiral out of control. And that is my great fear. And that we see this, it could be an accident, it could be a misunderstanding, it could be a heightened tension that leads one leader to decide now's the time, better use it or lose it. And the next thing we know, we have another Nagasaki happening in Berlin. We have it happening in Paris. And that would be something that would be world changing, and in a way that none of us want to see. Luckily, it's something that we can prevent. And that is the most important thing. And it's something that the Hibakusha have reinforced time and time again. This is something we can stop. It's a decision. There are other ways to de-escalate conflict, to prevent war, than the threat of incineration.
Yeah, and Susie, just to be clear, do you think the threat of nuclear weapons is greater today than it was back in 1945?
In 1945, there was one country that had nuclear weapons, and they used both of them to attack Japan. And that was all the nuclear weapons there were. That changed 5 years later, or 1949 rather, and the number has gone up from 180 years ago to 9 today. That is tremendously better than it could have been. There are 40 countries that have the capacity to build nuclear arms if they choose to, but they don't, because we have an international system that monitors and assesses and makes sure that nuclear materials are not being diverted into military programs. Only 9 countries. This is an easy problem to fix. These 9 countries sitting down together and saying, you know what, let's just take this off the table. Last year, they spent $100 billion on these weapons. And imagine what that $100 billion could do on other security investments, or on investments in the deep-seated underlying root causes of instability. There's a lot that can be done instead, and it is a choice. And we urge all of these 9 governments and their pro-nuclear supporters to make a choice that is better for everyone and that enacts the call of the Hibakusha these last 80 years. No more nuclear weapons.
Yuka, I'm curious about what the impact of these bombings was on Japanese society. Also, the way they're taught at the schools and the education and the generations that followed.
Well, there's no doubt that Japan is still reeling from what happened 80 years ago. But as I said earlier, that memory is at risk, at least, of fading. Even myself, when I spoke with Zichiro Mi, he spoke, we heard him for about 1 minute, but he spoke for about 45 minutes. And his testimony brought tears to my eyes. And that's what's important. That's what Hibakusha today are rushing to do, is to pass on, to tell their story, to pass on that memory to future generations. It's true that school children, they make regular trips to Hiroshima and Nagasaki to hear testimonies from the survivors. But outside of that, I think there is a genuine sense that people are starting to forget what really happened on the ground, and it is all the more important to pass on that memory.
Yeah, Susi, final thought to you. It's a world of polarization in many parts of the world, tensions in different regions. What do you think needs to be done as a priority to try to get nuclear weapons abolition?
This September, governments will be coming together, heads of state will be meeting at the United Nations. It's an opportunity to recognize the horrors of 80 years ago, to recall the words of the Hibakusha, to say in solidarity with them, let's never see nuclear weapons be used again. And it is also an opportunity to sign the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, to take steps to implement that treaty, and to commit through legal means to make sure this does never happen again. I expect to see more countries on board that treaty this September. And it's also the 80th anniversary of the United Nations system, a chance for us to recommit to the multilateral system of laws and norms that has kept the peace through most of the world in these last decades. And so I hope the next step is the UN General Assembly, more states joining the treaty, and even those states not yet ready to do so, at least acknowledging the horrors of the past and committing that they will never be the first to do so again.
Susi, thank you very much. Susi Snyder from the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. Also joining me on set was France 24's own Yuka Royer. Thank you. That's the news for now. Thank you for watching, and please stay tuned to France 24.